Welcome back to Zooming In at the Unpopulist. I'm Landry Ayers. Academia finds itself at a critical juncture, navigating internal debates over the lack of intellectual diversity and too much in the thrall of prevailing orthodoxies, while simultaneously facing unprecedented external pressures from political forces intent on reshaping higher education. How can institutions uphold their mission of truth-seeking and open inquiry amidst such formidable challenges? Today, senior editor Berny Belvedere sits down with distinguished journalist Cathy Young, who recently covered the Heterodox Academy's annual conference for the Bulwark. Together, they examine how internal criticisms of woke excesses and progressive orthodoxy intersect with the Trump administration's aggressive assault on academic freedom and civil society. They explore the critical question of whether focusing on internal academic illiberalism inadvertently aligns with broader authoritarian aims, and what it means for a heterodox movement to truly champion intellectual diversity against threats from both the left and the right. We hope you enjoy.
You recently attended the Heterodox Academy's annual conference, and you wrote about it for the Bulwark. It's a great piece. It not only recaps the conference, but it also raises interesting questions in its own right. So it doubles as a rundown of the event, but also it's a springboard to explore some of the issues that conference goers were wrestling with themselves. So let's talk about that. What is the Heterodox Academy? What are its origins? How big is it today?
It was started in 2015. It's basically the brainchild of Jonathan Haidt, and it's part of the pushback against, I don't want to say wokeness because it's such a cliche, but the progressive orthodoxy in the academy that at the time was definitely seen as being ascendant, that there was not enough intellectual diversity and tolerance. So the purpose was to steer the academy back toward an outlook that favored intellectual exchange, truth-seeking over the pursuit of perceived social justice, and that was the idea. The challenge is today that we find ourselves in a very different situation to 2016. It's interesting that even then, at the inaugural conference, the question is the pushback that the Heterodox Academy is providing, playing into the hands of Trumpism, came up. How do we not become a part of this backlash that was, in fact, enabling a lot of racism, homophobia, misogyny, and so on? Today, the administration is quite actively going against the universities and launching this crusade to bring the universities to heel and to impose certain viewpoints. So obviously in that situation, the anti-woke backlash, the question is, are you challenging the power structure or are you in fact aligning with the power structure? That's the big question.
So I've worked with folks from the Heterodox Academy in the past on some writing projects. I've published several of their fellows when I was at Arc Digital. From the beginning, the Heterodox Academy always struck me as a more sophisticated approach to critiquing what the right broadly sees as progressivism's excesses. And I don't mean to say that I always or even usually found their pushback persuasive, but just that it was the kind of counter-argumentation, the kind of heterodoxy that was refreshingly serious, especially amidst a kind of anti-woke commentary ecosystem that more often than not seemed to churn out substance-free, panic-inducing outrage bait. And some of these critiques did land. Some of these were well-crafted. It was at least worthy of grappling with.
I think the other thing that is important to note is that Heterodox Academy, unlike some of the other anti-woke groups, was very careful and very genuine about being nonpartisan. It wasn't a cover for a right-wing group that has somebody like Glenn Greenwald on board and then says, "Oh, hey, we're inclusive. We have leftists participating as well." No, it was genuinely nonpartisan, and there are people like Alice Drager, for instance, who is an ex-academic and journalist who really is genuinely a person on the left, not just somebody who calls themselves a person on the left to agree with the Trump administration 90% of the time. In fact, there were conservatives and Trumpists who were sniping at the Heterodox Academy from the beginning and saying these are just the same old liberals who are just posturing as tolerant, but in fact, they're not really welcoming to conservatives. They're not really going to stand up for conservatives who are sidelined in the academy. They just want more debates among liberals. In that sense, I think there was definitely a more sort of thoughtful approach and a more non-right-wing approach from HXA.
But there was a tension that I picked up while reading your excellent write-up, speaker at the conference. Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan University, appeared to be addressing his fellow participants at the conference, as well as maybe the attendees, when he suggested that a continued focus on, quote, woke excesses amidst Trump's assault on higher education is seriously misguided. You quote him as saying that we're living in a moment when the federal government is trying to destroy civil society by undermining the legitimacy of colleges and universities. We can play nice and not say that, and we won't get investigated. Or we can do our job, which is to call the indecent attack on our sector indecent, wrong-headed, lawless, authoritarian, fascistic, choose your words. But if you sit there and worry about the sociology department or whether Near East studies is really anti-Semitic, I think you're doing the work of authoritarianism. What I found really interesting was the response. You noted that his co-panelists did not disagree with his assessment of Trump's authoritarian attacks, which is to their credit, but they rejected the idea that they should stop focusing on the push for viewpoint diversity and fostering a culture of debate. You then reported that every conference attendee you spoke to, including attendees that you described as liberal Democrats, quote, strongly disagreed with Roth about the wisdom of holding back criticisms of left-wing academic orthodoxies. That response strikes me as a perfect encapsulation of one of the particular pitfalls of a movement that sees itself as heterodox. So a heterodox movement is forged in the shadows of a kind of dominant viewpoint, and it can never quite shed itself of seeing that viewpoint as the thing to always focus on, even when that viewpoint has receded from its dominant position. So let me be less abstract. The fact that Roth's co-panelists gestured that calling out Trump's authoritarianism is great, but that they registered this need to keep focusing on progressivism's excesses at a time when Trump is waging the most comprehensive assault on academic freedom that we've seen in ages, feels to me like that's blinkered in precisely the ways that heterodox people usually see the dominant viewpoint, the orthodoxy, as blinkered. What do you think about that?
I think it depends. I am more on the side of the people I was quoting as responding to Michael Roth. I think there's a false binary in saying that you either focus only on or primarily on the threat from the Trump administration, or not. One of the people on the panel who really most strongly pushed back against Michael Roth was John Balick, who's the president of Dartmouth, which was one of a fairly small number of schools that actually signed on to an amicus brief in Harvard's lawsuit against the Trump administration in terms of the funding freeze. So it's not just we're going to sit here and say, yeah, Trump is bad, but focus our real efforts on campus orthodoxy. So I think that it's possible to meaningfully resist what the Trump administration is trying to do, while at the same time taking steps to promote intellectual diversity on campus. And as I point out in my piece, while it's true that the orthodoxy associated with progressivism is receding, it's much too early to say that it's not a problem anymore. And one example that I gave that I think is really striking is that Salman Rushdie was basically pressured into canceling an appearance at Claremont McKenna College because the pro-Palestinian activists were aggravated by the fact that he had made some harsh but I think well-deserved comments about the degree to which a lot of people in the pro-Palestinian campus movement are sympathetic to Hamas. He didn't say, that Israel is justified in everything that is doing in Gaza. He didn't say anything very extreme. I mean, he basically said something that was quite reasonable. And just in terms of the symbolism, if you're canceling Salman Rushdie, yeah, boy, are you on the wrong track. Those attitudes still persist. I think there's still this sort of view that you're causing quote unquote harm if you discuss certain issues that various communities have strong feelings about. So I think that it is important to continue promoting the idea that if you're a university, you don't necessarily have to include every view. I mean, I don't think that anyone is going to say if you're going to be truly heterodox, you need to incorporate the opinion that slavery was perfectly fine, this sort of complete free-for-all where every view should be represented on the academic level. But there does need to be a acceptance that there is a broad variety of views out there. For instance, the question of whether the history of white supremacy in the United States means that, as a number of people claim, white supremacy is still embedded in various institutions. That's an open question. That is open to debate. Is that something that was basically extraneous to the sort of core American institutions and was eventually exorcised from those institutions? Or is it something that was, as the 1619 Project said, part of America's historical DNA? Those are legitimate topics of debate. There's still a kind of reluctance to consider some of those issues. I think that there's still a good reason to focus on some of those things, but it's a question of perspective. You can debate, for instance, from what perspective the history of racism in America should be studied in history classes, and to what extent contrasting views of the 1619 Project, for instance, should be incorporated. But, if you have the federal government basically coming in there and saying, well, you can't study those things because that's DEI, and you're not going to get any federal funding if you're studying something that smacks of the DEI, then I think the focus really has to shift to the attack on academic freedom from the federal government. That's really the upshot. That's the point a lot of the people who were criticizing Michael Roth were making. You should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You should be able to criticize two problems that coexist in time. But if you're not incorporating this attack from the Trump administration into your perspective at all, and if you're still criticizing wokeness as if it was 2021, then you are definitely missing a huge part of the picture.
That analogy that you just gave is apt in the sense that I think it's what a lot of people use to justify focusing on both Trump and progressives as a kind of multitasking that you have to be able to do. But let me see if I can frame Roth's perspective in an even stronger way by just shifting the metaphor a bit. So Roth had this line during his speech that you quoted. He said that criticizing fellow academics in this moment is akin to saying that the problem in Ukraine right now is that there's corruption in the mining industry. And some disagreed because ignoring corruption is never a healthy approach. And that's correct. As you put it, Ukrainians actually spend plenty of time criticizing corruption and other internal problems precisely because these problems often risk weakening and undermining the country's ability to resist the Russian invaders. But I want to shift the analogy a bit. Speaking for myself, I think a lot of heterodox types should stop focusing on wokeness, but that's because I think a lot of their critiques are unpersuasive and somewhat flawed. But even if I did think that progressives in academia deserve more calling out, Roth's argument, I think, is still a strong one because it introduces the idea of prioritization. So here's the way I'd shift the metaphor. Instead of seeing it as Ukraine can focus both on winning the war against Russia and stamping out corruption in one of its industries, I'd bring up the idea of medical triage. So, as Trump is waging war on universities, and I want to characterize that for a second in case people aren't quite as familiar with what he's doing, he's attempting to strong arm them into adopting policies that align with MAGA ideology and threatening to withhold their funding and all sorts of other penalties if they assert agency over their own operations. For academics who care about academia's future prospects to continue to focus on issues like why Ben Shapiro isn't given a kind of warm welcome when he gives a talk on campus, I think that's misguided. And again, not because ideological diversity isn't important, but because it's like having one doctor and then two patients who just showed up. One's been shot and the other twisted his ankle. Saying we can help both of them, it seems noble and it seems correct, but not if the degree to which the doctor focuses on that second patient impedes his ability to meaningfully assist the first patient.
I would actually disagree with that metaphor because we're really not talking about two different patients. We're talking about one patient, academia in this case. So I would say that it's really more like somebody comes in who has a heart attack. Obviously, that's what you have to focus on right now to make sure that the person survives the heart attack. But at the same time, if this is a person who has unhealthy habits that contributed to the heart attack and make recovery more difficult, you still need to say, we're going to take care of the heart attack, but you also need to look at your diet, your sedentary lifestyle. If you smoke, you obviously need to cut that out. So it's really more about a sort of holistic approach of looking at the health of the academy in this case. I would argue, for instance, that the threats to the academy are part of the larger pattern of, as Michael Roth said, trying to undermine civil society, of attacking core liberal institutions. We're really talking about an assault on liberal democracy in a very broad sense, and especially, of course, if you incorporate the whole history of January 6th into that and the way that they're going after anyone who was involved in the January 6th investigation. I can just sit here and deliver this long catalog of everything that the Trump administration is doing to attack democracy. I would say that if you have a strong presence in academia that promotes a kind of extreme cynicism about America's liberal democracy and tells people that it's really just a cover for heteropatriarchal capitalism, or it was created as a sort of vehicle for white supremacy. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of young people in particular have a pretty low level of confidence in democracy as such. I don't want to say that that's due only to woke professors or whatever, but I think that the role of progressivism in cultivating that cynicism really should not be discounted. I think it's something quite real. I mean, when you're telling people that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were really just sort of glorified slave owners, and the philosophers of the Enlightenment were racist and sexist, and that's really just basically all there is to it. I think that really does create a kind of essential contempt for the legacy of liberalism, which Trump is currently attacking. So I would kind of dig my heels in here and say that, yes, it really is important to maintain that legacy. It's also complicated because if you're going to talk about intellectual diversity, obviously intellectual diversity also has to include critiques of capitalism, for instance. You can't say, oh, we're going to have intellectual diversity, but no Marxist critiques are going to be allowed. one of the strengths of Western civilization is that it does have this tradition of self-critique and sort of intellectual self-examination. But I would say that certain types of progressive viewpoints really aren't unhelpful for pushing back against right-wing authoritarianism. I mean, the caricatured version of this argument is that the only reason that a lot of young people in the MAGA movement are racist, or, a lot of these, guys in the manosphere are misogynistic, that's really only just because these woke feminists and minorities were kind of bashing whites and males and got everybody upset, and now the whites and the males are kind of pushing back by being racist and sexist. I think that's a ridiculous argument. I mean, it's not as if racism and sexism didn't exist prior to the rise of wokeness. I mean, I think it's a complicated process. I do think, like, the sliver of truth in this argument maybe is that some people get annoyed with some of the more extreme woke arguments and some of the hostile rhetoric about whiteness and maleness, will go looking for politically incorrect viewpoints on YouTube, and then because they're young and stupid, they will quickly stumble into some of the really vile stuff. And then because they've discovered that maybe some of the claims made by progressives turn out to be inaccurate, then they'll say, oh, they lied to us about everything. So yeah, maybe actually slavery wasn't so bad either. And, maybe it was actually perfectly reasonable that women didn't have the vote. I remember watching this young woman who was like maybe in her early 20s, and she gave this little monologue on YouTube where she was like, I used to be this complete card-carrying feminist, and then I found out that some of the rape statistics were actually misrepresented. And then I went on YouTube, and now, like, my eyes have opened, and I know that women were never oppressed at all. And, it kind of made me want to pull my hair out. I don't think that's the main reason for the rise of these right-wing ideologies, but I think it is, to some extent, a kind of recruiting tool. And I think it's part of this whole toxic ecosystem of extreme viewpoints, which really do exist on the right and the left. And I think there is a certain truth to the argument that once you make it okay in progressive spaces to attack people for being white, male, straight, cisgender, or whatever, it makes it harder. It doesn't mean that that's the reason that racism, misogyny, and so on exist on the right. But it kind of makes it harder to push back against those things because you're splintering people into these, identity groups. So I think there is a very unhealthy left that makes resistance to the toxic right harder. And I am a believer in the principle that we do need to push back against both right-wing and left-wing illiberalism. We have to defend liberalism. And I think in terms of where the power is coming from, clearly today the attack on the right is far more dangerous. We have CBS being strong-armed into essentially giving the Trump administration a massive bribe in the form of a settlement of a completely ridiculous lawsuit. And that's just one example, obviously. I know there's this whole argument about hard power versus soft power. And I think you can make the argument that, when we're dealing with the kind of the hard power of the Trump administration going after universities, law firms, and so on, we really don't want to talk about the sort of soft power of prevailing opinions in academic departments or in publishing houses or in media organizations and so on. But again, groupthink is still a problem. I think it makes pushback against the Trump administration less effective. I see a lot of people on the left in places like Blue Sky, for instance, who are still doing the purity tests, basically saying, I don't really care if you're completely opposed to the Trump administration, being extremely kind of active and outspoken in criticizing its, attacks on the universities, for instance, or its attacks on the legal system. But if you've said things about Me Too, for instance, or if you've said things about transgender rights that we believe are not okay, we don't want you in our camp. We're going to attack you and write you out of the resistance. I see these purity tests, and I don't really see them so much on the heterodox side. I don't really see anyone saying, school, that you're also against Trump's authoritarianism, but I disagree with your view that transgender athletes should be playing in women's sports, so to hell with you, and I really don't want to work with you on opposing the Trump administration's takeover of universities. In terms of the anti-Trump camp, I see the purity tests on the left, not in the center. And I mean, I see a lot of this really bizarre hatred of centrists. I still don't really understand, for instance, why Matt Iglesias provokes this mouth-frothing hatred. It just really mystifies me. So yeah, I mean, I think that progressive left, with the identity politics and the purity tests and these ideas about bad ideas cause harm, quote unquote, I think it's actually doing a lot of harm to the anti-Trump movement. And, to the extent that it's something that exists in the academy, and I think it exists in the academy probably more than outside it, I think it's totally appropriate to criticize it.
Let me try one last question on this metaphor that I think you actually helped refine when you suggested that it's not two patients, it's one. So if a patient comes in and they're having a heart attack,
Right,
their arteries are clogged,
right.
and the doctor at that moment can focus on treating the patient for the heart attack, the most urgent thing that is happening, the thing that, unless the doctor helps treat, the patient will die. If the doctor were to sit the patient down and at that time, at that moment, start to talk about, let's talk about your eating habits. Let's see if you're making mistakes in terms of your diet. Can you log for me what you ate in the last week? The doctor would be guilty of malpractice.
Sure.
Rather than focusing on the more urgent thing, the thing that is more dangerous in the moment. So that's why I want to ask one last time about this notion of priority. And I actually have a quote from your article that I think brings us out a little bit more. So toward the end of the piece, you quote Heterodox Academy comms director as saying this: "If we want our universities to be seen once again as institutions committed to knowledge seeking, not ideological gatekeeping, we must embrace both forms of action, internal reform and external defense. This is not a zero-sum game." So that's not the way I'd personally put it, but it's a reasonable approach.
Right.
But you pointed out that she went on to say that as far as the Heterodox Academy is concerned, it will continue to focus on the internal reforms as its primary focus. So it's just going to stick with the pushback against what it perceives to be progressive overreach in the academy as its primary concern. But my question is, why though? If you diagnose that that's actually the greater threat, then that makes sense. But if you think that Trump's attacks are the more dangerous threat, the more existential concern, and I think they absolutely unequivocally are, then how do you justify continuing to de-emphasize Trump's assault and focus more on the wokeness stuff?
Another way to look at it, for instance, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, it used to be called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, so they've changed from a strictly academic focus. FIRE, which works with Heterodox Academy, and which in fact had displays at the conference and had a couple of panels, FIRE has definitely been very active in resisting the things that the Trump administration has done. It's part of some of the lawsuits against the Trump administration, not only in academia, but also in terms of the attacks on the media. And FIRE is probably, uniquely suited to do that because it evolved as an organization that takes action, including legal action, against speech suppression. You could argue that maybe FIRE and Heterodox Academy are sort of like the cardiologist and the nutritionist. You can see the cardiologist in terms of the urgent threat, but after you've taken action on that, you still probably should be going to the nutritionist to, develop a better diet. And, I think a heart attack is obviously, one metaphor, and that's the one I used. But let's maybe shift the focus a little bit, because the thing about a heart attack is that if you don't do anything about it, it's probably going to kill you in like 10 minutes. So you don't have a huge window of time to sit down and talk about your diet. But let's say that maybe the problem is that you have maybe less acute problems where you have a condition that is going to kill you soon, but maybe like not today. In those cases, I think it's entirely appropriate to, let's say, prescribe medications, or if you have heart problems that do require, for instance, surgical intervention, it doesn't necessarily need to be done like today. Your doctor may look at you and say, yeah, like at some point in the next year or so, you should probably get a bypass. But that doesn't mean that at the same time, you shouldn't be doing things to improve your diet and maybe, exercise and so on. If I was running the Heterodox Academy, I would say that at the very least, if we're going to do, this internal reform and promote these worthy goals, like, having more diversity of opinion and having more debate and so on, I would say, let's have a track where we specifically look at how we address this imposition that the Trump administration is bringing in. So they unveiled at the start of the conference 4-point agenda, which is very good. But again, it's looking at the sort of internal reform whose primary focus is counteracting the left-wing orthodoxy. I think it's worthwhile to look at this right-wing orthodoxy the government is trying to impose. I think that's definitely worth looking at. There are reports, for instance, of universities taking certain material out of classes on American history, like material that focuses on white supremacy and may therefore run afoul of the Trump administration's diktat. I mean, while I'm sort of defending the Heterodox Academy here, and I mean, I still think they're doing a lot of good things. If I was running the South Fed or if I was on the advisory council, I would say, hey, how about in addition to this 4-point agenda that we have that is primarily focused on threats from the left, let's look at ways in which the pressure from the right may actually be already affecting college curricula. That does need to be a two-pronged approach against right-wing and left-wing illiberalism.
I do want to give credit where it's due. You reported another anecdote. The Heterodox Academy founder, Jonathan Haidt, in his opening day remarks, he tried to lead attendees in a chorus of "We told you so." And let me give my own gloss on what that is, just to give background. It's basically him saying, "We, the heterodox academics, told you, the progressive academics, to reform your ways. And the fact that you didn't do so is why you got Trump. But you noted that many seemed uneasy with Haidt's call and response gimmick. So that's a plus."
Yeah, definitely. And I like John Haidt. I think he kind of got a little carried away there. I think it was
He got into rah-rah mode.
I mean, I think most people agreed, yeah, it was a not so great moment. So, with one exception, Mark Bauerlein, who is part of the DeSantis takeover of New College, Florida. But yeah, pretty much everyone else was like, yeah, that was kind of in bad taste. I spoke to Nick Wolfinger at the conference, whom I think you know. He said, I mean, come on, do we really believe that if the universities had been a little less woke, they had like a few more conservative professors or more people on the faculty who are center left rather than hard left, do we really think that Trump wouldn't be going after them?
You actually had a great line in it. You said, "It's hard to make with a straight face the argument that Trump would not have embarked on his power grab vis-a-vis elite academic institutions, or that the Trumpified Republican Party would have opposed such a power grab if the average liberal faculty member had been politically closer to Jonathan Chait than to Judith Butler."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the way that the right is using the term woke, at this point, you're probably like woke if you're 5 inches to the left of Genghis Khan. It's just become this catch-all term. I think Amy Coney Barrett is woke at this point, because she's voted against some of the anti-immigrant stuff. And yeah, so I think that at this point, the right-wing attacks on wokeness have really become a complete joke. I mean, it's like you're basically like you're woke if you disagree with the Trump administration about anything. I've been called woke.
Well, you're in good company. Superman is also woke.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Superman is woke. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, that is pretty good company. Now, where it gets complicated is that I do think that a lot of the reports of kind of crazy stuff in the academy, some of which is incredibly like exaggerated and blown out of proportion by the right-wing ecosystem, but some of which actually is accurate. You do have these stories of some professor being put on leave and investigated because he read in class an excerpt from Martin Luther King that contained a racial epithet, or, somebody being raked over the coals for saying that there are two biological sexes. I think it contributes to a general sense that the academy has kind of gone crazy. And again, I mean, I think it's incredibly exaggerated. But I will say, just as a counterpoint, that I have a couple of friends who are sort of refugees from academia who were graduate students in extremely woke departments. You talk to them and they'll kind of go with the "we told you so" stuff that Haidt was kind of, for a moment, they're pushing at the conference. So, I mean, I think that we really shouldn't underestimate the extent to which some of this genuinely toxic stuff on the left does kind of play into the toxic stuff on the right. Because you have to really walk a fine line. And, I try to do that, but obviously a lot of people don't, especially try to be too nuanced. But I think it's possible to argue that there is an interplay between the two without excusing some of the incredible ugliness on the right, which I think is just, through the roof at the moment. And I don't even mean just the Trump administration per se. It's also just the degree to which just out and out racism and misogyny are being normalized in fairly mainstream portions of the right. Like, we have Tucker Carlson basically pushing Nazi sympathetic narratives right now, where maybe it wouldn't have been such a bad thing if Hitler had won, because at least we wouldn't have all this wokeness and immigration. And so, I mean, I'm actually not misquoting him. I mean, he's basically said that. Like, what was the point of Churchill beating Hitler if we have an Olympic show in Paris that has drag queens? And so, I mean, it's just completely...
No, you're absolutely not misquoting him. He's
Yeah.
bringing on, to help his viewers understand the Epstein scandal, that quote-unquote historian, Daryl Cooper,
Yeah, right.
he had said that in World War II, the outcome that actually happened, the Allied victory, he can't imagine a worse outcome than what actually happened. This is a person whose audience was the biggest of any cable talking head show that was around.
Oh, yeah, and he's also somebody who was very closely involved in Trump's 2024 campaign. Like, he spoke at the RNC. He did several interviews with Trump during his campaign stops.
And now he's mainstreaming Nazis. Let me again credit the Heterodox Academy for the way they've approached things.
Mhm.
It seems like there were simultaneously blind spots there, but also instances of a kind of commendable willingness to self-scrutinize. And I want to actually focus on one line that you had in your piece. You contrasted two different models of the idea of heterodoxy. And you said that one is heterodoxy as it should be, and not heterodoxy as code for anti-woke.
Right.
What's heterodoxy in its proper form, in your view?
Well, I mean, heterodoxy, by definition, is sort of anti-orthodoxy, right? So heterodoxy is a commitment to a diversity of viewpoints. That doesn't mean that, to be properly heterodox, you have to be willing to debate the virtues of pedophilia, or the historical merits of slavery. Obviously not. But for the sake of intellectual diversity, I really do think that you should strive for the Overton window to be as wide as possible. As somebody who's pro-choice, I would say that certainly anti-abortion, pro-life viewpoints should definitely be a part of the sort of permitted discourse within the academy. And there's certainly a wide range of viewpoints that I personally disagree with that should be part of the discourse. As much as I loathe even like the idea that NATO expansion was to blame for Putin's attack on Ukraine, I mean, does that mean that I want to cancel John Mearsheimer? I think that he should be vigorously argued with, but he certainly should be able to make his argument without suffering retaliation. So yeah, I mean, the kind of the good version of heterodoxy is definitely, having a wide range of debate. And unless you're talking about essential aspects of human rights, everything else should be up for grabs. Is genocide good? Obviously not up for grabs. Or is it okay to use terrorism to promote your political agenda? No, obviously not up for grabs. But other than these sort of very obvious exceptions, I think there should be a very broad range of viewpoints. I would also say that without turning it into an orthodoxy, I do think that the academy in liberal democracies really should have the worth of liberal democracy as its default position. And I think it should be presenting that viewpoint as the default viewpoint to students. That doesn't mean that you don't, for instance, have a course in which you examine the ideas of monarchists, as long as you're not like reading a lot of Curtis Yarvin, which really would just be a waste of time. But people in political science classes, for instance, should seriously contend with reactionary thought in the 19th century, in the wake of the French Revolution. And, in the same way, I think it's perfectly fine to study far left critics of illiberal society. But our starting point should be the goodness and the worth of liberal democracy. Heterodoxy, I think, should also be about not allowing ideology to take precedence over facts. And I think the search for facts really should be essential. And I'll give you an example. Like one of the kind of more left-leaning speakers at the Heterodox Academy conference was giving an example of the Trump administration's attempt to kind of stamp out DEI and to say that, you cannot have courses that promote sort of DEI-based ideas. And he basically said that if you're looking at various issues in medical science, there are actual health disparities between various population groups in the United States. And African Americans, for instance, really do have many disadvantages in terms of healthcare. And it's definitely worth looking at ways in which racial disparities, social disparities contribute to some of these medical disparities. And perhaps, the ways in which racial prejudices among some health professionals, not necessarily overt racism, but just sort of certain assumptions that may be made about Black people, for instance, may contribute to inadequate healthcare. And he basically said, we really don't want to say, as a matter of science, we don't want to say, oh, hey, you cannot look at the possibility that racial inequities may contribute to some of this because, that's wokeness. And I totally agree with that. And I think that's a completely valid viewpoint. But the other side of that is that I think in many cases, these questions start with the assumption that disparities are due to racial inequity and don't necessarily look at other things that may even have a historical root in racial inequity, but don't necessarily reflect actually existing racial prejudices here and now. So if you're going to look at those issues, you really do have to look dispassionately at the facts wherever they take you. And you can't start with the assumption that, racism is at the bottom of this. Do you remember when the term mansplaining was fashionable? And there were these claims that women in the workplace are kind of held back by being kind of interrupted and, talked down to and so on. And I think there were some studies that people were citing. And it turns out, actually, that if you reanalyze those studies, at least some of them, it turns out that women do get interrupted more than men, but they're primarily interrupted by other women. If you're in the academy and if you're going to look at issues that may have a relation to social justice, you really do have to look at those facts wherever the facts take you.
But to your point, here someone comes out with research, and if another researcher finds a methodological flaw or finds that their explanation isn't good, then they publish that, and then that's how we refine, this body of knowledge that we've got. What we don't want is the government's thumb on the scale of, this is what you can talk about, this is what will get you in trouble with us, and then that kind of creates
and this is what is going to get your funding cut. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was checking out Campus Reform is highlighting just as one of their news items. Wow, a university is having a course on the Black experience, and it's using Kendrick Lamar lyrics to analyze it, as if that should be sufficiently a cause for alarm, as opposed to something that if you want to take, you can, and if you don't, you don't, but not something that, the government needs to look into this. So I think we're in agreement that there should be a flourishing of viewpoints, and there should be scholarly pursuits that aren't inhibited, especially by the government.
Right. I do think that you have to very clearly take a stand that, you are not inviting the government to come in there and put its thumb on the scale.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of The Unpopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.